Hello, everyone. Welcome to another series of our assembly event. My name is Amtana. I am a Learning Network Manager at the Digital Data Design Institute at Harvard University. Today, we're joined by Hewel, who will be taking us through the topic of using data in an educational context. And Hewel, I'll hand over the floor for you to do a little bit of introduction. And unlike our the format that we follow in our usual events for assembly, today is going to be more of a conversation. So we have a number of questions that I'm going to present to Hewel and get his insights. So it should be very interactive and very exciting. So Hewel, I'll hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, a little quick introduction. My name's Hewel. I have worked in analytics for the vast majority of my career, so coming up to about 18 years or so, since leaving university. And about the last 10 years, I've been within the education sector. That was in the UK with Ofsted, which is the regulator for schools and children's services. And then most recently, for the last sort of 6 years, over in the Middle East, working for one of the largest private education providers, the international schools. So a good background in education analytics. I thought to sort of set the scene today, you can see the slide on the screen. A lot of people I talk to when I mention data analytics in education automatically think it's purely about the attainment of students. But actually there's quite a lot of data that is collected and utilized in education, certainly within universities and international schools, private schools as well. So I'll just sort of run you through some of those to give you a bit of context before we talk some of the questions later on. So the schools and universities, colleges collect a lot of personal information. That's not just on students, that's on parents, that's on teachers, administrators. There's a huge amount of information that goes into that. Very sensitive information as well. There is the performance, and that's the performance of how students get on, their attainment, their growth, various different bits, but also the performance of teachers. So from a HR perspective, how are the staff performing? There's HR data, so that comes into all your sort of salaries and performance development information that is collected. Customer experience information, which is very important in the context of education. That's understanding how your parents and your students receive the education setting, what they like about it, and also the experience from your staff as well. And there's commercial elements, so there's sales, there's marketing, there's tuition fees there. There's other commercial side that's come in terms of sponsorship and donations and things like that. There's health data that's collected on students and staff as well. Well-being data, safeguarding data. So again, another sensitive element of data. And there's lots of different financial information. So there's around contracts, there's the fees that are coming in, the rent that buildings cost, and lots of elements there. So the full sector is actually the same as pretty much any other business. It collects a whole load of information. But interestingly, a lot of it is sensitive because it's looking at students, which in the main are children. So that hopefully gives you a little bit of context around the data we're going to be talking about today. It is quite wide. It's a wide breadth of information. And as we dive into some of the questions, we'll probably dig into some of these areas a little bit deeper. Should we kick off with some questions?
Awesome, sounds good. All right, so before we get started with the questions, I want to make sure that please interact with us, send your questions through the chat, and if they're relevant to the topic or to the question that we're discussing at the time, I will present them to Hewel. If not, we will kind of store them for later. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answer from the audience. So I just want to make that clear to our audience. So jumping off to our first question, could you speak to some overarching and generalizable ways educational organizations could leverage data to drive performance, growth, and innovation?
Yeah, so very similar to other sectors, analytics can have a powerful impact on how education institutions or any other institution operates. K-12 schools up through to universities, there's quite a lot of different ways they can look at from a commercial point and an academic point. If I start with the commercial side of things, there are streamlining operations, which you would see with any other business. It's making administrative processes easier, but also going through things like registration of students or admission of students, making that a smoother process. They can do that. Analytics helps you understand that process better to make it more efficient. Looking at resource optimization is another area that's used quite a lot. So in education, it's around facilities, it's around courses. Do you run courses that don't have any students in them? No. Do you need teachers to teach courses that don't have many students? No. So you can start to sort of utilize your resources there. And even the facilities that are in your building, you can start to use those a little bit better. It's also used quite a lot for recruitment and retention as well. So understanding the recruitment journey and the type of teachers and lecturers that you're bringing in, and you can sort of then target based on your needs. So if you're a school that is expanding and offering new subjects, you need to start looking for teachers that can maybe teach 1 or 2 subjects, because operating a new class with 6 students, you probably don't need 1 teacher for that. It's half a teacher. So can they teach 2 subjects at a time? So you can start to look at those bits and as you expand out. From an educational viewpoint, it's very interesting because there's a lot that can help the learning experience of students. You've probably all heard around personalized learning. It's something that comes up quite a long time, and not everyone always understands what that means. But data and analytics used well, you can start to understand students better. You can understand their individual needs, their preferences, the pace they need to learn at, their ability, and you can start to personalize that learning journey for them based on the data you're bringing in. Adaptive learning systems are another area that's used quite well. Again, you utilize the data analytics to understand the student, and then you can adapt that learning journey for them. So similar to that personalized part. It's also used quite a lot for early warning systems to try and stop students slipping through the gap. So if you can spot where a student is underperforming or struggling earlier, you can start to put interventions in place. And data helps you find that. Not one data point in its own, but using a variety of different data points can help do that. And there's also the predictive side of it. So if you have enough data and enough years worth of data, you can start to understand how a student might perform in the future. And again, have those early warning signs. If their data that's coming out is showing they might not reach the level they should do, or dropping off, you can start to put things in place to try and do that. So there's quite a few areas that cover that in terms of academics and commercial. And from an innovative point of view, all those things there can be quite innovative to organizations in terms of improving efficiencies. There are some interesting things coming out in the education sector around some emerging technologies, certainly around AI and machine learning. Actually, recently I was chatting to an ex-colleague of mine who's a good friend, who works in this space of emerging technologies, and he was talking about AR, augmented reality and virtual reality, and how that can really help innovate learning experiences, certainly for children who may struggle to go into some of the physical spaces to see these things, or can't travel different countries. Those new technologies are often quite a good innovative way of teaching and learning.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think we do have a question about emerging technologies and using data to make use of those emerging technologies in an educational context. So definitely excited to get to that question. But the second question is, can you share your thoughts on how educational institutions can build the capabilities to be data and insight driven?
Yeah, it's having had conversations with people similar level to me in different organizations and sectors, it's actually very similar. We need to establish that data-driven or data-informed culture. That doesn't happen overnight, but that needs leadership support. So as long as your leadership teams are on the same wavelength of you setting up that culture and using data to inform different practices and improve the way that your organization is being run, that's pretty key. Creating awareness of what you're doing and why. Data is as much about people as it is data. You need people to come along on that journey with you, and making sure that your faculty, your leadership teams, your board, whoever that might be in your organization, is aware of what you're doing and why. that helps that momentum to get forward. Nobody really likes change, and everyone really needs to understand why change is happening. So if you're going down a data-driven route or a data-informed route and trying to make things a little bit different, you have to get people to understand why you're doing it and what's the benefit to them. What will they get from it? What will other people get from it? So those are some things there that are quite true. Talking around data fluency or data literacy, getting that foundational level of people in your organization to understand data and understand how to use data is something that works very well. You can do that by having analyst teams working with your experts on different areas, and that sort of brings up the levels. So the questions they're asking are more pertinent to the problems. Many times as an analyst, I'd be asked questions, can you give me this data? And I think when I was younger in my career, you give that data. And as you get a little bit older and you go through these things, the questions come back and say, why do you want that data? What is the problem you're trying to solve? So having that back and forth with people really helps that understanding. And I think there's, in tandem with that, investing in some of the skill sets that analysts have. The teachers don't need to be analysts, but it helps if they understand the analytical mindset. So investing in those elements are quite key. So that's more from the culture perspective, I think. There's the wonderful part of the infrastructure. So ensuring that your data infrastructure, your platforms are, looking towards what you're trying to do. If your goal is to be data driven, you need your systems and your ecosystem to be aligned to that as well. So having a data strategy and a digital strategy that align to your overall strategy, having those things working together seamlessly helps that data all come together. If you talk about triangulation of data, that personalized learning, there's no point having lots of data sets in silos. It's not going to help anyone. So having that ecosystem and that infrastructure really does improve that. And then probably data governance. It's an area that isn't as sexy as the analytics side of things, but without that good foundation there, you're probably not be able to do the fun stuff. So it's making sure that your data is robust, it's quality assured, it's been collected in the right way, it's protected. Those sort of things need to be put in place. So if you can get that culture together, you can get that data infrastructure together, you can get the sort of governance elements together and the quality elements together, you're on a sort of sound footing to be able to go forward.
Thank you. There are a few questions that are coming through the chat that I think we will touch upon as we continue with our questions, but I'll make sure that if we haven't, if we don't get a chance to touch up on these questions, however, in passing, I'll make sure to bring them up at the end.
I've just put them up on the side so I can see.
All right. All right. The third question, which I think is relevant to a couple of questions that came through the chat, is could you talk about a few examples in which you use data analytics to help stakeholders in educational organizations make informed decisions, focusing on decisions that are commercial or business facing? And I think in our conversation earlier, it came up that even educational institutions can potentially be considered businesses, and they are in fact businesses. So I think if we can give a few examples of how you use data to help stakeholders make decisions that may not necessarily come across as business decisions, but they are. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. The first element, doesn't matter if you're a K-12 school or a university or a college, you're looking for admissions or enrollments, and that's one of the key areas that data analytics can help. That looking at that enrollment funnel, admissions funnel, to see how that is going, to see where you're getting people drop out of there, really understanding the process that a parent or a student takes to be admitted or enrolled in your part there. So those things are really, really key. One of the areas that I've worked a lot on is customer experience. Again, for a K-12 school, you have two customers. You have a parent and a student. The student is attending the school, and the parent is the person who's chosen the school or is paying for the school. And in that sense, it's key to understand what they want. And education is one of the most emotive industries or sectors, probably alongside healthcare. From a parental point of view, they're putting their child in the care of a school for sometimes over half a year. I think schools run from about 180 to 200 days a year. So over half of the year, they're spending their time in schools. So from a parental point of view, it's understanding really what they think. Bain suggests that, I think it's, if you increase your retention by 5%, your revenue can increase by about up to 95%. So making sure you keep students in your school and making sure you keep parents happy is paramount. And from a customer retention point of view, parents will tell you their challenges with the school. They'll tell you what they like about the school. They'll tell you what you need to change about the school. That information is really, really rich. If you can harness that, you can then make changes, and you can make changes to your school to improve, but you can also do things alongside your marketing. From work that I've done previously, we've utilized what parents say is important and what parents want to make sure the schools do that, and then marketing that as well. So you're getting the best of both worlds. You're improving, and you're, from a business point of view, getting more customers coming in. So retention coming in and admissions. So I think alongside it, that retention, admissions, marketing side of things, those are really key bits that schools can look at.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. How have you used data to build capacity and improve performance of individuals and teams in the educational organizations you led? And there seems to be a sub-question that actually may help clarify. So how can data analytics help educators optimize their impact in the classroom? I think you touched upon a couple of these points at the beginning. And how can data analytics help the students improve performance and learning outcomes and help administrators streamline and optimize services? If the question is too specific, if you can speak from like a more general point of view, because,
Yeah, so I think one of the areas that data analytics works really well is with efficiencies.
Right.
And within sort of the education sector and many other sectors, that's freeing up time for people. A lot of people's jobs is doing those tasks that can be slightly slow and repetitive, whereas analytics can step in and do those quite quickly. You can automate them with things like that. So freeing up time for people to do the things that make more of an impact is quite key. So if you take a commercial part of it, I mentioned before about marketing and sales and the enrollment process. If data analytics can highlight areas that marketing should focus on, it can highlight challenges within an admissions and an enrollment process, and it can give marketing ideas of what to do. It's freeing the time up from them to not play around with the data, but actually get stuck into their expertise, which is marketing or sales and enrollment. The same with human resources. If data analytics can understand the need of the school or the organization in terms of what staffing they need or what training and development they need, the experts can then put that in place and not have to worry too much about doing it. That there has to be a collaboration between the two elements, or whatever that is, from analytics to any other department. If that's teaching, if that's HR, if that's sales, marketing, they're the experts on that area, and analytics is the experts on their area. But together is when you get that powerful output that works better. If we flip that to an education side of things, again, teachers aren't analysts, and they collect lots of data. There's every lesson some data is collected: attendance, behavior, well-being. There's assessments, internal, external. So there's huge amounts of data being collected, and normally that's not the expertise of a teacher. Yes, your maths teacher or your physics teacher might be quite capable of playing around with that data, but potentially someone who works in the humanities and arts hasn't had that background. So if the analytics team can put in place tools or data products that help do that, it really speeds things up. So some of the stuff that I've done in the past is data products in terms of dashboards, and essentially pulling some of those data sets together to allow teachers to focus on what the data is showing them rather than trying to analyze the data. So instead of having to play around with lots of different data sets, they can click in, understand which students need to be focused on, understand which students are performing above where they should be, below where they should be, where there's some challenges and things, and then put in place those interventions. So it's giving them more time to teach and less time to do background. So that improves their performance, it improves the output for them. And from an analytical side, you get a better understanding of what they want and need working with them. I think that probably covers quite a bit from the education side. It's, there's giving people insights quicker than they would normally get them, and giving people better insights than they would normally get, I think, are the things. So the analytical side of things can pull together multiple data sets and give people a well-rounded idea of what's going on, and they can do that quickly. I think that's the real benefit for every different sector that sort of analytical teams work with. It's aiding them to do their job better, enabling them to do their job better and quicker.
Thank you. And speaking of data analytics helping people to do their job better, I think there's a question in the chat by Frank. He provided two questions, but I'm going to choose the second one, where he asks, I heard you emphasize the importance of efficiency as a benefit of using data analytics. How can technology or data analytics also help do the opposite, strengthen creativity? I wonder if you have any thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of technology out there that does aid that creativity in terms of design, technology around different apps and things like that. Certainly with ChatGPT, which I think we'll touch on later, allows people to do those things there. But I've worked with schools that have media labs, that have AI labs in there, and I think technology can come in and do those things that when I was a student we didn't have any of those things. And probably the job I do now wasn't a job I thought about when I was at school 20 odd years ago. But thinking about where students are now and the jobs they're going to be looking at in 10, 15, 20 years, they're quite different. It's going to be far more digital. It's going to be far more technology driven. So I think schools can put in place a lot of the technology that allows them to do that. And there's some great companies out there that are giving quite free or low cost solutions. I know Alteryx, which is a tool I've used in the past, provides education organizations with free data analytics tools to help them learn data science and machine learning. And that's a creative element. The one thing I always talk about is within data, getting the data through is a process clean. Actually, when you get it, it's a creative element to analyze it and try and work out what's going on. And using data visualizations and data storytelling are creative elements within my sector. And I think the more schools can embrace those different things and bring in different digital technology to help that, I think it's great.
Thank you for that question. Moving on to the second question that I have here. Speaking of ChatGPT and emerging technologies that significantly impact the education space, what are some risks to be cognizant of when applying data analytics in the context of educational organizations? And there's a sub-question to clarify, what precautions should be taken to make sure sensitive student data, for example, is kept secure?
Yeah, so the risks are quite high. When I mentioned earlier on about the different types of data sets, that a lot of those are sensitive information. So I think security and privacy are key within this. So making sure that the data that is captured is held securely. Access is only granted to those people who need it. A administrator in a school is going to have different needs than a teacher, than a board member, and making sure that the access rights to data are correct for each person. And that changes over time. Different projects, people change jobs, so they should be reviewed quite a lot. So data security and privacy of data is really key when it comes to just to the sensitive area. In terms of using data and applying analytics, there's also lots of challenges that come with that as well, around the misinterpretation of data. I talked earlier on about understanding the context with experts. I'm not an educator, so I didn't have that full understanding of different education data sets until I actually worked with educators. So you have to have the balance of the expertise from educators, and you have to have the technical side and the ability side of the analytics side from the data team. I've been lucky enough to work with lots of really good educators who have happily told me and helped me learn about different parts. I've been the person who's asked the stupid questions. I don't know this, tell me the answer, and that's really helped. So having that, mitigating against misinterpretation is really key there. If I start to do analysis without knowing the context, I'll come up with some inaccurate conclusions or bad judgments that can have an impact on students or on institutions. So getting the full context is key. There's also a key part with ethics. Certainly within K-12, you're using data for children, and you have to have an understanding of the ethical consequences of using that. So one thing is collecting data and using it for the intended purpose. So you can't just collect lots of data and then use it freely afterwards. You have to use that for what the intended purpose is. You should really be telling your customers, your students and your parents, or even your staff, what you're going to use that data for when you collect it, and not stray out of those boundaries. There's certainly things to think about around bias as well in some of the data you use. So if you're using external data sets, there might be some bias in those, and if you're matching that back up to your data sets, depending on where you are and the makeup of your cohort of students, the demographics and those things, you can you need to be aware of any of those bias challenges that can come in, and certainly within elements of ChatGPT and things like that, and machine learning that's out there, there are biases in those things.
I'm very glad that you mentioned the word bias, because that directly relates to the second question, that the next question that I have, which is about how should educational organizations deal with potential biases in educational data that impact decision making, especially in relation to student assessment and performance evaluation?
Yeah, it's knowing the data you're working with. If you have an understanding of what data sets you have available and what you're working with, you can sort of understand that bias. If you don't, then you don't know. And that's always a challenge when you're looking at predictive models, or if you're predicting how students will perform, and the data set you've based it on is based on US state schools, and you're using it in the Middle East context of different nationalities and different backgrounds in terms of learning, you're probably not going to get the right answer from that. And you really need to be aware of the data set that's come through and how you're using it. A lot of data sets that are used, sort of big data sets in that sense, come from Western countries who are more mature at collecting data over a longer period of time. So they're better used in those areas, but they tend to be based around more affluent areas as well. So you have to be aware of the data set you're going to use for anything in that. If the data is your own and you're based on it, and you sort of understand that your context hasn't changed massively over time, then you can sort of go, I don't think there's going to be too much bias here. You should check that within your algorithms and your models. But yeah, it's a risk when you start to pick up external data sets and benchmark against those to understand where you are, unless you understand the context of those data sets.
All right, so changing gears just a little bit, but not veering off too much. There's a question I have here that is also very much relevant to the question that came through the chat by Ginger. So my question reads, what is the current state of the application of data analytics to augment human and business performances in the educational landscape in the context of the Middle East? And if you'd like, from your experience, like Ginger pointed out, if you would compare it with your experience working in other contexts than the Middle East as well.
Yeah, so wherever you go, there's a range of maturity and ability in schools and education institutions, from the very high to the very low. From my experience in the Middle East over the last sort of 6 years, the application of data analytics is emerging, and it's rapidly emerging. There's a primary focus probably on personalized learning. The Middle East is a really big melting pot of cultures, and people coming from different curriculums and different backgrounds with different levels of, first language is not always English, but a lot of instruction is English. So personalized learning is something that's been looked at in a key way to really try and enhance the performance of schools and spot those bits. That's also gaining a little bit more traction from a commercial side as well, because parents want their child to have a personalized learning route. The adoption of sort of advanced analytics tools within education is growing as well. Certainly from the commercial side, it's looking at student churn and staff churn and things like that in terms of efficiencies. And the introduction of ChatGPT as well is sort of coming along. In comparison to sort of other areas that I've worked, I think the best schools in the Middle East are at a similar level to the best schools in the UK, Europe, or the States. I don't think there's a huge amount of differences at the best schools. When you're looking at more of a national level across the countries, I think the UK in the US are a little bit more mature in terms of how they're using data because they've got a longer history of using that data. They've been collecting data sets for decades. So they've got more of a history of using data to look at policies and procedures and developing curriculum and instruction. And I think that's something that is slightly different from the Middle East to the US or the UK. They also have a bit better, a bit more established data infrastructures. The organizations like Department for Educations and things like that have been more well established, and the schools are probably a lot older and have had this sort of infrastructure put in place. That doesn't to say that that's going to change. I think the Middle East and certainly the UAE and Dubai, where I've worked quite a bit, they're catching up pretty quickly, and they haven't got so many of the legacy issues that will be a problem when you come to scale and change that will happen in the UK and the US. So there is that, in the next couple of years it might switch and they'll be ahead. One thing that's always interesting, I think emerging countries in that sense have been going to the US and European countries and Australia to look at how things are done. And I think in the future that might switch, whereas countries will look at how multicultural societies like the UAE have adapted quite quickly and changed things quite well. I think the Middle East is catching up with the rest, and I don't know when it'll overtake, but it'll certainly be on the same level within a few years.
I want to look a little bit closer to Ginger's question. She asked at the very end of the question, in your experience working with organizations, have you faced any resistance or hesitancy to implementing data analytics, and how did you possibly deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's in industries that aren't as mature when it comes to data analytics, I think there is always a little bit of a pushback and a challenge. It's why do you want the data and what do you want to use it for? And I think people's first instance sometimes can be that looking into data analytics will highlight issues and challenges that they have. And it's trying to flip that to go, if we do spot issues and challenges, the aim is to spot them and fix them. So a lot of it, and I talk about this in a sort of as a marketing way for analytics teams, is you have to sell what you do. I'm not there to make somebody else's job worse. We're there to help them do their job better, more efficiently. And I think if you can sort of speak to people around that sense to go, look, you have a problem and we want to solve it with you. Not solve it for you, solve it with you. And that collaborative approach to go, look, what is your problem? What do you think is happening with it? Let's have a look at the data. Can we pinpoint why that might be happening? Some people will see a large problem, but actually analytics helps you drill in to go, your problem isn't a large problem. It's a certain area within that problem that we need to fix. So it targets it a little bit more. So there is certainly a sort of an internal sales marketing approach that you have to take to try and win people over. But unless they see a benefit at the end of it, they're not going to join you on your journey. So you have to go in to solve their problem, not a problem that you think is there, but their problems.
Thank you for that. So my next question is about what is the current state? Oh, sorry. What do you see the future of data analytics in the educational landscape to be in the aforementioned regions? And if you can take into consideration the recent advent of technologies like ChatGPT, and also in the chat, without overwhelming you with sub-questions, Frank asked about what do you see in a few years ahead? What new competencies will teachers need to create value for students? So if you, to the best of your ability, if you can respond to like an amalgamation of these questions, but in a more general sense, like what do you see is the future of data analytics in the education space?
Predicting the future. It's a good one for someone who works in data analytics. I think the future is pretty good for analytics in education. There's a lot of promise. Technologies are getting better and they're getting cheaper and they're getting more accessible. So I think there's going to be a lot more influence going forward. That brings challenges as well, as we know. I think, if we think about the Middle East, over the next 5-10 years, they will gain more and more data sets around what's happening here. And there's been a lot of government involvement in both the public and the private sector in terms of improving education standards. So I think they are going to really, really move forward with data analytics. Smart cities and things like that will come forward. I also think the areas of sort of the Middle East in particular, they're more open to change the way things are done. because they haven't got so much of a history of how things have been going. If you think about the US and the UK, schools have been very similar for decades. People sit in classrooms and face the front and do things on a normal way. So I think those countries that are sort of emerging and catching up and becoming more mature will be more open to changing the way things are done. I think that's something that's going to be key. I think to the company I used to work for when the pandemic started, there was a switch to remote learning, digital learning. It was done pretty smoothly. There was challenges, but it was done pretty smoothly because the infrastructure was there to allow that. And I think from my experience with the UK, that was far more of a challenge. Students missed out on quite a lot of learning because they didn't have the infrastructure set up to run these things. It took a while to be put in place. Whereas I think, the Middle East has the technology to do those things quite well. I think predictive analytics is going to be used a lot more in student ways. Some schools are using it now to look at grades, but they tend to look at that future grades when the examinations in your APs or IB or A levels, whatever it might be. But I think, gathering more and more information as schools do, they'll have the ability to use predictive grades a little bit more and predict where students might be going. So I think technology is certainly going to help that. Personalized learning is going to get a lot better. More and more data is being collected on students, and if you have the infrastructure in place to use that, that's going to improve things massively. It's wonderful if you have there's no point just having attainment for a student. You need attainment, you need growth, but you need to understand the ability of that student. You need to understand if there's contextual stuff such as well-being influencing it. The teacher will also have their own input to know those things. So when you pull those together, you can really get that personalized learning and that predictive output. So I think technology will allow for that a lot more. At the moment, it's probably a bit of a challenge for schools at a state level and at a lower cost level to put in that technology. But as we know, over time, technology gets cheaper as new things come along and people can start doing those things as well. So I think that will be interesting. Things like ChatGPT or Google Bard or I think they will be more and more frequent within education, both from a teaching perspective and from a student perspective. It'll be interesting to see how that happens in the next few years and how that goes in, because it's sort of slightly not regulated at the moment, and depending on what governments want to do, that'll be interesting to see how that would. But it's a hugely impressive technology. It's an assistive technology as well, and I think that's something we always need to remember, that it's not going to replace a teacher. It will assist the teacher to do their job, and it's not going to replace learning. It will come along and people can use it as an assistive technique. If you think back over the years, students have always had new things, calculators, laptops. They're assistive technologies to help them learn, and I think ChatGPT will be one of those and will help students quite a lot in that way. I'm trying to remember what the rest of the question was. There was a few of them.
Yeah, I think you covered pretty much all of them, at least the ones that I had in my sub question. We talked about the impact of ChatGPT in the educational landscape. So I think that covers pretty much everything. I do have one more question from my end, and there are a couple of questions that I want to.
I'll just jump back onto that one there with the ChatGPT, because it's one that always comes up as a really interesting area. And no matter what you do, so I use algorithms and different bits to help me do. I don't do the math myself. I write the equations, and the equations are done from that sense. And in using ChatGPT, and I've played around with it in different areas, it's only as good as the questions that are asked. And if you're using it for analysis, or if you're using it for writing content or essays or something, if you ask the wrong question, you're not going to get the answer you need. So I think there's an element of that, whereas old school teaching and learning, in terms of the foundations of mathematics, the foundations of language, and how you construct sentences, is still needed to be able to use the technologies in the best way possible. So I still think there's this, I go back to that assistive technology rather than replacing technology. I think it's still going to be a few years before, if it ever happens, where it's completely replaced by that.
I appreciate that note. All right, moving on to the last question that I have on my end, and there are a couple of questions that I want to come back to that were raised through the chat. So I feel like this is a good question to end, quote unquote, end our conversation. But I wonder, what are a few important challenges the education sector has to grapple with related to data infrastructure and governance? And I think you mentioned these words a little bit earlier, and you alluded to the fact that we'll talk about them a little bit later in our conversation. So I was wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think if I start with the sort of the governance element of that, people need to understand what governance means, and I'm not always sure that governance is the best term. It's the common term, but it sounds a bit sort of brutal, doesn't it? The governance of things, but it's essentially, if you build that data culture and you get people to understand that governance is actually really about security and protection and ethics when it comes to these things. So building up your data fluency or data literacy levels within your organization will help you, mitigate some of those challenges that come around the governance part. If everyone has a foundational data literacy level, data fluency level, they have the ability to understand that we need to protect the data, we need good quality data, we need the processes in place to help those things, and that will be a massive step forward for every organization, because that will help you put good quality data in place. And if you have good quality data in place, you can utilize it a bit more. So another area that's going to be important to sort of is a challenge, and it's infrastructure in that sense, is the silos of data. If you're collecting lots of data and it's sitting in different systems, you're not going to be able to utilize it. So if you want to move forward with how you use data analytics, you need to move forward from your ecosystem sense, and you need to build a cohesive ecosystem that actually moves data around seamlessly. The advent of cloud systems over the last few years and the charges that they have has actually come down quite a lot. So, moving from that legacy way of doing things, and a lot of places and people on the session may know about the joys of Excel spreadsheets sat in lots of people's computers across different areas. Everyone's got their own database. Trying to get away from that into a sort of, this is where we keep data, this is how we use data, and using data marts to say this is the right data to use. Breaking those silos down is going to be something that's really important. And other challenges I think are there in terms of the infrastructure is the scalability. If you think about 10 years ago, not as much data was collected that there is now. I think in 10 years' time, even more data is going to be collected from schools, from all the different stakeholders that are there. So having that infrastructure that can scale with the growth, I think is going to be a challenge, but it's something that needs to be done. But it also needs to be flexible to adapt to different things. So no one saw the pandemic coming and the increase in the use of digital systems and collecting data. And the organizations that were able to sort of be flexible and adapt to that because their systems allowed it are the ones that did really well. And from a personal point of view, if the education sector is going to collect more information, you need more people that can utilize it. So there's going to be a need for more analysts in the education sector. The challenge you have there is that every other sector is doing the same thing with data. So getting the right analysts in place is going to be more of a challenge over the years. I know a lot of curriculums are inputting data analytics as part of the curriculum now, and I know the UK has digital as part of its curriculum, and that will help. In 10 years' time, there will be more analysts available to come and work in different sectors. But I think that's going to be a challenge, to have the right amount of people to help schools and education settings try and do those things.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of the insightful responses to my questions. There is one question I want to come back to that was raised in the chat. And then in the meantime, if anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free to give me a sign if you'd like to unmute and ask the question live, or put your question through the chat as well. One question that I want to come back to is, obviously you are someone who spends a lot of time thinking about data analytics, especially in the education context. And one of the questions that came through was, what about analytics for capturing student learning processes to help them to improve better their learning outcomes. So this question is for parents, maybe even students who are currently attending this event. Why do you think they should care about data analytics in terms of helping students improve their learning outcomes?
Yeah, I go back to that element of understanding the whole picture. Student learning outcomes, different things can influence them in different students. High ability child may not be performing to their right level, but if you don't know what that right level is, you don't know what their ability levels are or potential, it's tricky to understand. So I think from a student point of view, it might seem that you're doing quite a lot of assessments in different places and collecting it. But in doing that, you give your educators a better idea of what's going on, so they can start pinpointing it. And the same from parental point of view. My son is only 3.5, so I'm not too worried about a lot of these things yet. But from my point of view, if the teacher understands what my child needs, where his strengths and weaknesses are, where his the pace he likes to work at, the type of interactions and work he needs to do, and all those little bits, he can actually work with him far better and get a better outcome from that. One thing's been interesting from customer experience data I've looked at. 3 things that are most important to parents. The first 2 are pretty straightforward. It's the safety of the child and the happiness of the child. But the third one, it didn't really matter what age you're looking at or what curriculum or what country it was in. It was talking about being ready for the next steps. And I think from a parental point of view, you want your child to be ready to move through with that from KG into elementary, into middle, into high school, or onto college, whatever that might be. I think it's key that the education team in that school, be it counselors, be it teachers, whatever, have the knowledge, the data, the information to set that child up to succeed and move through. So I think that's a really good way of looking at personalized learning, is making sure that each child reaches their own potential. Not every child's going to do wonderfully well in every examination and test. People learn in different ways. People want to do different things. But making sure that you know what the potential is of that child and trying to use data analytics to get them to reach that potential, I think is something that both students, parents, and teachers will be key and happy to do.
Thank you so much. And this is such a great note, I think, to end our conversation. If there are not any more questions from our audience, I think this concludes the event. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And I would also very much like to thank Harold for your time and for the very helpful insights that you provided in response to questions that I had and some of the questions that came through the chat. For our audience, please make sure to share your feedback through the link that I shared via the chat box about today's event. And if you also have any speaker recommendations that you would like to see featured on our assembly events, please make sure to share that in the second form that I provided through the chat as well. Once again, thank you so much for your time and contribution, and we will see you again in our upcoming assembly events. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.